All right. Happy Monday afternoon and election eve, we should call it. I'm Anjanette Levy with Xavier University political science professor extraordinaire, Mack Mariani.
Hello.
Happy Monday, everybody. So Mack, we're in the home stretch here. Yesterday, I think Joe Biden held 2 or 3 events. He added Cleveland today, along with one in Pennsylvania. President Trump had 5 rallies yesterday. He's having 5 today, all the way up until like 10:30 or 11 tonight. He did the same thing yesterday, and he has his children and the vice president also out and about all over the place today as he did yesterday. So does any of this last minute campaigning mean anything?
Well, most of the research, most of the research focuses on presidential visits, presidential campaign visits generally. And I think the general consensus is it doesn't seem to correlate with any boost in the presidential campaign's fortunes. I think we're in a sort of uncharted territory here, though, because what we have in typical races is both candidates out there hitting, as many stops as they possibly can. And what we've seen with this year, closing the gap a little bit in the last days, is that Trump is hitting 5 or 6 of these a day, and Biden sometimes is doing 1 or 2. He's gearing up today. Obviously, it's the last day. But my sense is that probably it doesn't matter as much in terms of voting, particularly when so many of the votes have already been cast in this election. I mean, it's a different thing when you have a month of voting versus 1 day.
Yeah, and it's pretty interesting to me, the long lines everywhere, the long lines, and I keep hearing, and it's hard to, I feel like I don't know who to trust. Like it's all, what is spin and what is fact? I keep hearing that the Democrats, are ahead in early voting. I think they obviously are in Hamilton County, which is to be expected, but that the Democrats are banking all these votes and that there will have to be just this tsunami army of people that come out for Trump on election day in order for him to win. But then you hear something else. I don't know if you've heard this. Some other people saying, well, the Democrats are disappointed in what they're seeing in the early vote thus far, especially in Florida. So what do you make of any of that? What do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like reading entrails or something, right? We're like witch doctors, like just trying to figure out. Particularly challenging too, because not all states collect voter registration, party registration the same way, right? In New York, where I grew up, we have to register with a party. You have to declare yourself a Republican or a Democrat, and that kind of sticks with you in a stickier way. Here in Ohio, it's based on whether or not you voted in a primary, and that typically will, if you voted in the last possible primary, you're a Republican or a Democrat, and obviously we're able to kind of carry over people who were Republicans last time and didn't vote in the Democratic primary this time. So, but it's a little bit more complicated. It's not, even if you consider yourself a Republican or a Democrat, you might not go to the polls for primary day. It's just, it's a very small number of people actually vote in primaries. So it probably undercounts in Ohio. But everything we've seen seems to confirm what we think we know about early voting, which is that the Democrats have been emphasizing it, the Republicans have been discounting it, and to some extent, in Hamilton County, we've seen just really high numbers of early voting, and that probably looks like a good sign for Democrats to have those in the bank. In places like Florida, North Carolina, they're beating Republicans, but not in the numbers that they expected to or hoped to.
Right. And I'm kind of wondering with Ohio, with that Quinnipiac poll that came out, and they say that's, that poll was right last time, saying that Joe Biden's ahead by 5. But, I've talked to at least 2 kind of political types who say that Trump is going to win Ohio. I don't know how they know that, but they seem to think that
part of it is just the stability of our electorate. Partisanship means that people don't switch very easily. Trump won by 9 last time. That's a big amount of shift in a state to happen. The demographics of the state tend to skew towards Trump. You have a lot of people who are non-college educated, white voters, a big group of that older electorate, which tends to skew. It's been trending towards Biden, but generally seems to benefit Trump in a state like Ohio. So I think when you look at the sort of fundamentals of the demographics here in the state and where it was last time, it's a pretty good guess. I think the real clear politics polling average has Trump ahead by 1 in Ohio, which is, when they take a bunch of polls and they just average them together. But we're also seeing Trump running kind of underperforming in places like Texas. And so it's very hard to kind of predict where the election goes in terms of, it could be as much as a gigantic Biden blowout or a narrow Biden loss. But I think you probably have to guess that Biden's got the advantage just looking at where the numbers are. And I see Gerald is here.
Yeah. Hi.
Hi.
Hello.
So let's pivot to Wisconsin, Mac. So Wisconsin, a battleground where President Trump, I think he might be campaigning there today. Jerry, we can't see you. Is your webcam not on?
Oh, let me see if I can get you the screen.
There
Here
you
I
go.
am. Here I am.
Hi there.
Hi there.
So this is Jerry Podair. He's a good friend of mine from the state of Wisconsin, a Lawrence University history professor. And we kind of at Mack, Jerry Mack.
How are you?
So we're recording on Zoom right now, and then I'm going to upload this to Facebook and YouTube because I still haven't figured out how to get this to stream on Facebook. I'm still working on that. So tell me, if you would, what's going on up in Wisconsin? I was just telling Mac that on the Today Show today, Chuck Todd said that he's heard from the Trump campaign that they're not feeling good about Wisconsin and Michigan. But then you hear people from the Trump campaign, publicly at least on television, say they think that they can win Wisconsin. What are your thoughts?
Well, I don't think it looks good, particularly good for Trump in Wisconsin. The polls have, what's struck me about the polls, not just in Wisconsin but nationally, is how stable they have been for as long as they have been. Usually at the very, very end, when a candidate is behind, we saw this with Dukakis in 1988. We saw a little bit of this with Romney in 2012. They make a little bit of a run. There's a little bit of a run right at the very, very end where things seem to be getting closer. We haven't seen that in Wisconsin. We haven't seen that nationally. I mean, these numbers have been basically stable for 2 or 3 months through everything, through COVID, through the Biden Hunter Biden scandal. We've seen like basic stability. So my guess is that whatever the Trump campaign is saying publicly, I think they're prepared to lose Wisconsin, and I think they will.
Interesting. Do you think that they will also lose? Do you think Trump will lose Michigan? And he's been going to Minnesota too. Last time he tried to flip Minnesota. So is he going to still lose Minnesota and Michigan, do you think?
I think this could pretty much be a pretty solid Biden win. And actually, I made a note of six states. Okay, of these states, Florida, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin. As I calculated, Biden only needs to win 2 of these states, and he'll be in pretty good shape to win the election. Trump probably needs to win 5 of the 6, and I don't think he's going to do it. Again, I'll just say Florida, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Ohio, where you are, obviously, Michigan, and Wisconsin. If Biden wins 2 of these 6, I think he is odds on to win this election. Trump needs almost every one of these states.
Mac?
I would agree with Jerry that I think that everything, looking at these numbers and looking at the stability, it seems very, the polls have to be off they have to be modeling the electorate wrong for this to, for Trump to win the election. Or, you know, if you look at particularly if you look at the national number where I think Nate Silver has Trump behind by 8.5 points, that's a really hard thing to overcome, even with the electoral college advantage. I see Trump's path a bit more favorable to him, in the sense that I think the path would be through Arizona, where the Real Clear Politics average has Biden up by 1. Obviously, having to hold that southern portion of the electorate, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina. Obviously, as you move up through Ohio, and then it all comes down to Pennsylvania, right? So it's Arizona. For me, it's 2 states, right? Arizona and Pennsylvania, and holding all those states in the South that he had held before. I think that gives Trump a good chance. There's a path to win it without the upper Midwest. It just gets a lot harder. And Arizona's going to be a very tight, everything's got to kind of tip his way. And I think that requires that requires the modelers to be a little bit off, at least at the national level, probably.
Trump got a black swan in 2016. He really did. I mean, if you look at the margins in Pennsylvania, in Wisconsin, in Michigan, I mean, everything sort of had to drop his way, with a singularly unlikable Democratic candidate who is fairly or unfairly, who is the opposite of Joe Biden in terms of his personality and the effect that Biden seems to have on the American electorate. There are people who disagree with him. There are people who think that he may be cognitively challenged, but nobody doesn't either like him or at least accept him as a human being and as a person. And in the end, I think that's what's going to put him over. Nobody hates him. He's difficult to hate.
Yeah, I think that's probably his biggest advantage is the fact that, and that's one of the reasons why it's been really hard for Trump to pull down his favorables, even with the Hunter Biden stuff.
Right.
He's fairly well known. He's obviously very well known among the electorate, and he's relatively liked, and that's a hard thing to move.
Right. And if you look at Biden's almost 50-year career, I mean, I'm sure there are other senators who did not respect him, who might have viewed him as, intellectually lazy or just maybe even just a hack politician, but they all liked him as a human being. He was one of the very few senators who could actually reach across the aisle and get along with Republicans. I mean, his relationship with John McCain, which was, of well known and of long duration. I mean, he spoke at his funeral. I think is an example of that. Now, whether that actually comports with reality, we don't know. But it's not reality that matters at this point. It's perceived reality.
It's interesting you say that, because I recall when President Obama was in office, I don't know if you all recall this, but they always said that, President Obama was more kind of cerebral and intellectual, and he wouldn't go up to Capitol Hill, or, he wouldn't talk with the lawmakers. And so they would send Joe Biden up to Capitol Hill because he had been there forever and as a senator, and they would send him up there to make a deal. Do you guys remember that?
Yeah, I do. And that's one of the reasons I think, I think Obama is a very self-aware politician, and he understands his strengths and weaknesses. And one of the reasons that I think he chose Joe Biden as his vice presidential nominee in the first place, after Biden memorably, condescended and disrespected him, where he said what he said, he was clean cut and articulate.
Yeah.
You would think that would be the end. Well, one of the reasons that wasn't the end is that Obama understood that he had only been a senator for a brief time. He is not a deal maker. He's not comfortable with that. But Biden is perfect for that role. He could basically, as you say, send him up to Capitol Hill and let him do the talking to senators that he had years and years of experience with, even Republican senators. So I think that's pretty much the reason that Biden became vice president.
All right. So What is Trump doing then? Is he just hoping this last minute sprint and holding his rallies, or does he look at this? If you think he's going to lose, Jerry or Mac, it sounds like you're skeptical that he can win. Is he just is this his last kind of moment in the sun and he just wants to soak it all up, or is he just going to give it his all till the last minute?
Yeah, he has no choice here. I mean, this is what presidential candidates do. This is what incumbent presidents do. This is what Jimmy Carter did in 1980, by the way. I mean, he also at the very, very end, the last couple of days, he was campaigning 20 hours, and on the plane home from his last campaign appearance, it's like 5 o'clock in the morning already on election day. His people tell him the numbers don't add up and you're going to lose. And it's quite possible that maybe Trump will get the same thing from his advisors as he comes in from the last campaign appearance. It's interesting, Anjanette. Way back in 2012, I remember you covering a Romney rally.
Right.
You wrote to me. And you said that this is maybe 5 days before the election, and you wrote that you had never seen the numbers and the enthusiasm that you were seeing. So a lot of this can it's deceptive sometimes. The kind of enthusiasm you're getting, in the last weeks. Here's another Ohio story going back to 1960. JFK campaigned really hard in Ohio, which at the time was a Republican-leaning state. I mean, sort of maybe even is now. And he really worked Ohio hard. He got huge crowds, shook an immense amount of hands. And then on election night, it's clear that he wins the election, but he loses Ohio. And he holds out his right hand, which is like swollen to like twice the size of his hand. And he says, "You see what did that? Ohio did that." So he shook all these hands and got all this enthusiasm, and he lost. He lost the state.
Okay, that's pretty funny. And I remember that Romney rally. It was up in either Westchester or Liberty Township, and it was like all the Republican stars were there. Kid Rock was there performing. Wow. I was like,
can't get any bigger than that, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a Kid Rock person, but I was like, Kid Rock, really? With Mitt Romney and Kid Rock? It just didn't seem to add up. And I remember Nikki Haley was there, Marco Rubio was there. I think I interviewed Marco Rubio. John McCain may have been there. I don't remember. But I just remember I couldn't believe the number of Republican stars that were up there on the stage, and that it's pretty Republican up there in that area of town. So I was like, wow, I was kind of stunned. And then he, lost.
Yeah.
Lost spectacularly because Obama could, turn out his people. So Mac, what are your thoughts on that? Is he just sprinting to the finish line because he has no other choice?
I'm more bullish on Trump's chances. I think it's more of a 3 in 10 chance. I think one of the I think if Trump does pull it out, which I think is a long shot, I think the polls are generally pretty darn good at measuring the electorate. But one of the things that I think we might be missing is that this unique nature of this campaign. I mean, the Democrats, and you could probably speak to this too, Jerry, typically have an army of students who are going door to door all summer long. They're working the polls, they're knocking on doors, they're registering voters. Didn't happen this year. The Democrats basically stood down on the ground, and the Trump people didn't. And they invested in get out the vote efforts all summer. So it's kind of, it's a different sort of election than maybe we're used to. The fact that we have so much early voting, which does tend to benefit the Democrats to lock in their votes, it also creates a lot of uncertainty. It's just everything kind of flows a little bit differently. Does that work all to Trump's advantage? No, probably not. But it also creates, I think, a much more difficult difficult for the pollsters to model this election accurately, I think, just because what's turnout going to look like? I don't know.
Looking at it historically, Mac, I'm a historian, so I view everything in historical terms. I really think about this election in terms of the 1932 presidential election between Roosevelt and Hoover. And the reason I think of it in those terms is that at the time we had an unprecedented economic crisis in 1932, and that can't favor the incumbent, whether it was Hoover's fault or not.
Right.
But here we have something that's even beyond that. We have an unprecedented health crisis, a hardly precedented economic crisis, an unprecedented racial crisis, and even a cultural crisis, if you want to bring that in as well. So we have a simultaneous health, economic, and racial crisis that can not favor the incumbent. It just can't. Whether this is all Trump's fault or not, I think it's impossible for an incumbent to overcome something like that historically.
I think you're right about the crises, although I guess what Trump would be hoping for is that this is in particular the unrest and other things that we've seen make this more like 1972 than 1932.
Right. But what would have helped him is we saw what went on in Philadelphia a few days ago, but still that's not like what was going on during the summer. Timing is everything, and it may be a little cynical to say, well, that's not exactly number one on people's radar screens right now. What was going on in the summer? What's number one is COVID, and certainly here in Wisconsin, that's pretty much all that people are talking about with good reason.
All right. Well, this has all been very interesting. I'm so glad, Jerry, that you could come and join us, and
Right.
both of you guys for coming on. Mack has to go. He's he's very popular, so he's booked on all kinds of programs. He just kind of made some time for me, but no, I'm just kidding. But he has a thing to go to. He has to go do a show. So it's been great. So it sounds like Jerry thinks Biden's definitely going to win. Mack thinks Trump could possibly win, but it's a long shot. And we'll hopefully find out tomorrow night. And if Pennsylvania is going to decide this thing, it may be like a week. So we'll find out.
Maybe weeks.
Yeah.
Nice to meet you, Jerry. Thanks again.
Right.
Good to
Bye,
meet you.
everybody.
Good to meet you.
See ya.
Good to see you, Angela. Right. Bye-bye.